At this point, we have a pretty good idea of how to work with async await, right? However, there is one important thing missing. So right now, it might still be a little bit unclear what an async function actually is and how it works. And so let's now fix that. So to understand a bit better what's actually happening here, let's start by adding some more console.logs here. So let's say we'll get location, and then in the second one here, we will say finished getting location. And if we check the result here now, I hope that you already know what the order of the logs here will be. So let's see. And so indeed, immediately we get the first log, then the second one, and of course, only after that, we get all the logs coming from the async function. So again, that's because this is an async function that runs in the background. And so JavaScript immediately moves on to the next line here. Now, if this was indeed a regular function, and there would be a console.log in that regular function, then of course that would appear here between 1 and 2, right? Well, let's call this 3 here actually. So it would then appear between 1 and 3. But in this case, it's an async function, and so therefore it runs in the background until the results are there. All right, but now let's say that we wanted to return some data from this function. All right. So let's first get rid of all these console.logs here. Put this all a bit better together. And so here at the end, let's now say we wanted to return a string like we had previously based on the geocoding data. So that data is in data geo. And so let's say you are in datageo.city, and then just quickly the country here as well. So we return this string here, and so let's say we now want to get, of course, that data out here. And so for now, let's pretend that this is simply a regular function, and then we would do this, right? We would simply define a variable, then there we would store that returned value, and then here we could take a look at that. But what do you think is going to happen here in this case? Well, let's see. And so the second thing that is logged to the console here is this promise. And remember that back then, when we first started to work with async await, I told you that an async function always returns a promise. And so here is the proof for that. And if we think about this, then it actually makes sense that here we get a promise and not the value that we would like to get. So this string here, right? So the reason for that is that at this point of the code, JavaScript has simply no way of knowing yet this string here that we want, because the function is still running, but it is also not blocking the code out here. And so therefore, again, at this point, JavaScript has no way of knowing what will be returned from this function. And so therefore, all that this function does return is a promise. Now, the value that we return from an async function, so again, that's this string here, will become the fulfilled value of the promise that is returned by the function. And so that's important to understand. So again, this promise that we see down here, the fulfilled value of that promise is going to be this string here, because that is the value that we return from the async function. Well, at least if there is no error here happening in the function. But for now, let's assume the success here again. So, since we know that this here will return a promise, we also know how we can actually get the data that we want. So all we need to do instead of this here is simply where am I? So let's comment out these two. And so this will be our promise. And so then, just like before, we can use the then method to get the fulfilled value of the promise. And so let's call that one city now. All right. So we're using the exact same variable name like we did here. But of course, this one here didn't work. But here it is going to work. Because again, in the then handler, this argument that will be passed into the callback function is going to be the resolved value of the promise. And so one more time, that is this string here that is returned from the async function. And so now let's see what happens. So let's wait for it. And so now we get our result. You are in Olhão, Portugal. Okay. And so with this, we essentially successfully returned a value from the function. Now we will be able to do a little bit better, but for now, let's think about errors. So if any error occurs here in this try block, then this return here will never be reached because the code will immediately jump here to the catch block, right? So let's just try to create some error here. So I will just change this one here. And so now nothing will work. So let's wait for it. And so indeed, now we have an error. And so now here we get undefined from line 543. And so that's this one. And so indeed, now nothing was returned from the function. And so we get undefined. Now, what's interesting here is that the log still worked. So this console.log here, which is now logging undefined here, is still running, which means that this callback function is still running, which means that the then method was called, which in turn means that this promise here was actually fulfilled and not rejected. So even though there was an error in the async function, the promise that the async function returns is still fulfilled and not rejected, right? And in fact, if we add a catch handler here, then let's see what happens. So console.error, so error.message, then our emoji here, and actually let's add a 2 here. So the sequence is kind of 1, 2, 3. And let's do the same here. All right. And so we should still get the error from here. And indeed, we do. But still, it is this callback here that is executed. So that's why we get 2 undefined and not the catch block. And so again, what that means is that even though there was an error in the async function, the promise that it returns is still fulfilled. Now, if we wanted to fix that, so if we want to be able to catch that error here as well, then we would have to rethrow that error right here. So rethrowing the error means to basically throw the error again so that we can then propagate it down. And so with that, we will manually reject the promise that's returned from the async function. So let's say reject promise returned from async function. So here we can now take the error and throw it again. So throw error. And so now we get the same error here as we had here. So again, it's cannot read property flag of undefined, and here the same, and with this too. So it is coming from here. And so sometimes it's important to do this, and so rethrowing an error is then the correct solution to that problem. All right. And now, finally, if we wanted to fix not the error, but the fact that the 3 is printed before the 2, well, then how would we do that? Well, we can simply add a finally here, right? Because the finally, as you already know, is always gonna be executed. So no matter what. All right. And so now we only get the 1, then we should get the 2 with the error, and then the number 3. And indeed, if we remove now the error from here, then 1, 2, 3, just as expected. All right. So I admit that this might have been a little bit confusing, but I hope that you understood how all the pieces fit together here. Now, this of course works just fine, but in my opinion, there's still a problem here. And that problem is the fact that doing this here kind of mixes the philosophy of async await with handling promises using then and catch, right? So we are mixing the old and the new way of working with promises here all in the same code. And that's something that I personally don't like. So I prefer to always just use async functions instead of having to mix them. And so let's now go ahead and convert this to async await as well. And we can do that because, of course, we can treat the promise here that is returned just like any other promise. And so, of course, we are able to handle it using async await. So that's what we're going to do next. Now, it would be great if we could simply use await without the async function, but that doesn't really work. At least for now, because there is actually a proposal in the works to make this happen, but for now, await can only be used inside an async function. However, we don't really want a new complete function here. And so instead, we can use an ify. So remember ifys from way back. They are immediately invoked function expressions. And remember that this is how we create one. So we write function, then here the function body, and then in the end, we simply call it. And so, of course, we can also easily create an async ify as well. All right. And actually, this pattern here is one of the last remaining cases for ifys. All right. And now I actually want to leave the conversion of this to the async function for you as a small challenge. So please pause the video now and take a minute or two and write the code yourself here. All right. So let's start with the try catch block. So try catch. Here we get access to the error. And then let's actually immediately do this part. And then here we can simply await the where am I promise. Okay, and then all we have to do is to store that result into the city variable and then log that to the console. So that's just this. And now finally, this last part here, we can simply put it outside of the try catch block. And so then it is always going to be executed no matter what. Okay, so let's comment this one out. And we should get the exact same result. And let's wait for it. And here we go. So great, we managed to do the conversion. And now everything is using async await. And so that's much nicer. And now we know how to basically return data from an async function and how to properly receive and handle that returned data, right? And actually in the real life, this is something that happens all the time. So it's pretty common that we have async functions calling other async functions and returning values between them. And so that's the reason why I'm showing you all this. So to make sure that you really correctly understand how async functions work behind the scenes.